House Lannister of Casterly Rock had always been rich. Gold ran through the ground beneath their castle the way water ran through everyone else's. But rich is not the same as feared, and for most of the Seven Kingdoms, that's exactly how the Lannisters were seen: wealthy, comfortable, and soft. That reputation belonged almost entirely to one man, Lord Tytos Lannister. Tytos was not cruel. He was something the Westerlands found almost worse. He wanted, more than gold, more than power, to be loved. Lesser lords, hedge knights, and merchants down in Lannisport and Case learned very quickly that House Lannister's coffers opened easily and its debts were never actually called in. Men borrowed against Casterly Rock's name for years and simply never paid it back, because Tytos could not bring himself to be the villain who demanded it. Two houses in particular grew fat on that weakness. House Rains of Castamere, old, wealthy from their own gold mines, and quietly convinced they belonged somewhere higher than they currently sat, and House Tarbeck of Tarbeck Hall, proud and just as eager as the Rains to see exactly how far a soft lord could be pushed before he pushed back. The two houses were bound closer than most people realized through one woman, Ellyn. Ellyn was the eldest of three Rain siblings, born above her younger brothers Roger and Reynard, and for a while she came astonishingly close to becoming Lady of Casterly Rock herself. She married Sir Tywin Lannister, then heir to the Rock, in the household of old Lord Gerald. When Tywin died years later, the inheritance passed instead to his brother Tytos, and Ellyn, still ambitious, still convinced she belonged at the head of that household, made one more attempt to hold on to her place there. She tried to seduce Tytos himself, urging him to set aside his own wife for her. Tytos confessed everything. Furious, Lord Gerald married Ellyn off in disgrace to Reyne-Tarbeck, the aging Lord of Tarbeck Hall, and she never set foot in Casterly Rock again. So when, years later, Tytos announced that his daughter Jenna would marry Aemon Frey, arranged by the endlessly scheming Lord Walder Frey, every lord in that hall understood exactly what kind of insult they were watching. House Frey wasn't poor. They were rich, in fact, sitting on tolls collected at their bridge crossing over the Green Fork. But that bridge was only 600 years old, and so was their family's claim to nobility. New money, in a land where houses like Lannister traced their line back to the age of heroes itself. To the old blood of Westeros, the Freys weren't lords. They were glorified toll collectors who'd bought their way to a castle, and Tytos had just handed them his own daughter because he couldn't bring himself to tell Walder Frey no. It landed on the Westerlands as a very public confirmation of everything people already suspected about House Lannister's new head. Roger Reyne, now Lord of Castamere, and known as the Red Lion, stormed out of the hall in fury. His sister Ellyn, Lady of Tarbeck Hall, didn't storm out at all. She stayed, and she laughed at a family that had cast her aside once, watching its current lord humiliate himself in front of the entire court. That contempt hadn't gone unnoticed at Casterly Rock, but contempt alone doesn't start a war. What did was gold, and someone finally deciding to collect it. Tywin Lannister was 19 years old, heir to Casterly Rock, and had spent his entire life watching his father treated as an easy mark by men who owed him money and never intended to pay it back. When Tywin effectively took the family's finances into his own hands, he did something his father never had the stomach for. He ordered a full accounting of every debt owed to Casterly Rock and demanded it be repaid in full. Ellyn herself had borrowed a small fortune in gold from House Lannister to rebuild her husband's crumbling seat at Tarbeck Hall. Gold, like so many others' debts, that had never been paid back. Any lord who couldn't settle what he owed was ordered to send hostages to Casterly Rock as surety instead. He did not ask his father's permission for any of it. He simply acted as though the Lord of Casterly Rock had already stepped aside, which, in every way that mattered, he effectively had. Tywin sent ravens to both Castamere and Tarbeck Hall. The message was not a request, it was a summons. Come to Casterly Rock, answer for your debts, answer for your insolence, in person, before him. It was less an invitation than a test, and it was designed so that failing it would justify everything that came after. Both houses failed it. Rather than kneel to a teenager and pay what they owed, Roger Reyne and Walder Tarbeck raised their banners and formally renounced their fealty to House Lannister instead. It was open rebellion, and it was, whether either of them fully understood it yet, a fatal miscalculation. Tywin marched immediately. 3,000 foot and 500 knights gathered and moving before his own father could fully process what his son had just started without him. Houses Marbrand and Prester rode at his side from the very beginning, the first of many lesser houses that would spend this campaign quietly deciding which side of history they wanted to be standing on. He struck Tarbeck Hall first, and he struck it almost unbelievably fast. In less than a day, his men had siege engines raised outside its walls. There was no drawn-out siege for the defenders to wait out, no time for word to even properly reach Castamere for help. Tywin had a single massive boulder hurled over the walls, and it came down directly onto Tarbeck Hall's aging keep. The stone collapsed inward and buried Ellyn, along with her young son, Tion Tarbeck, who had become Lord of Tarbeck Hall only moments earlier, after his father and half-brother had already fallen in the same engagement. Tywin's own younger brother, Tygot, would later say that Tywin smiled when he learned Ellyn was dead. With the keep in ruins and resistance broken, the gates were thrown open. Tywin had what remained of Tarbeck Hall put to the torch. Roger Reyne never got the chance to save his sister. He'd gathered 2,000 men at Castamere the moment word of the rebellion reached him, and marched them hard toward Tarbeck Hall. But he arrived after an exhausting forced march, only to see the castle already burning against the night sky. There was nothing left to defend. He turned his men around and rode back to Castamere to prepare for what he now knew was coming for him next. 3 days after Tarbeck Hall fell, Tywin's army arrived outside Castamere itself, and by then it had grown considerably larger than the force he'd left Casterly Rock with. Houses Banefort, Plum, Stackspear, and Westerling had all fallen in behind the Lannister banner along the march. None of them needed to be told what was happening. They could see it clearly enough. A young lord, moving with terrifying speed and total confidence, having just brought down a castle on top of his own enemies inside a single day. Every banner that joined him wasn't really a statement of loyalty. It was a house deciding, very quickly, which side of this war it did not want to be caught standing against. Inside Castamere, Roger and his younger brother, Reynard Reyne, understood exactly what kind of trap they were in. There would be no relief force coming. Tarbeck Hall had already proven that. There would be no negotiated compromise handled quietly between lords, the kind that usually let a rebellious house keep its name and its lands in exchange for hostages and humiliation. What they were looking at, gathering outside their walls, was a boy who had already shown he wasn't interested in the usual rules. They tried anyway. Twice. Reynard Reyne sent word offering Tywin peace. House Reyne would stand down and swear themselves loyal vassals again if Tywin's own younger brothers, Kevan, Tiggot, and Jerion, were handed over as hostages to guarantee it. It was the kind of arrangement that had ended 100 smaller feuds across Westeros without a drop of extra blood. Roger Reyne offered something else entirely. Older, more personal, and in its own way, more honorable. Single combat. One lord against one lord, the fate of two houses settled sword to sword instead of army to army, sparing every soldier, every servant, every innocent person still sheltering behind Castamere's walls. Tywin refused both. He had no interest in trading his own brothers into another house's keeping as collateral, and even less interest in gambling House Lannister's future on a single duel, however honorable it might look to the small folk watching. He wanted something the old rules of Westerosi warfare didn't really have a category for. An ending so complete that no one would ever again mistake House Lannister's patience for weakness. So instead, his men sealed the entrances to the old gold mines running beneath the castle, the very mines that had made House Reyne wealthy enough to imagine themselves above their station in the first place. And then they diverted the river running near Castamere down into those same tunnels. There was no storming of walls that night. No burning arrows arcing over battlements, no ladders thrown against stone. Nothing a maester could later write up as a proper battle. There was only water, filling the dark, rising through passages that had no other way out. Guards standing watch at the blocked entrances said they could hear screaming rising up faintly through the rock itself. Muffled, distant, and then, after one final night, gone completely. Tywin had the keep of Castamere set ablaze. When it was finished, House Reyne and House Tarbeck were not simply defeated. They were erased, wiped out entirely in the male line, their names left with no one to carry them forward. Only 2 Tarbeck women survived the entire rebellion, left alive almost as an afterthought. Word of what had happened at Castamere spread through the Westerlands and then out across the rest of the 7 kingdoms faster than any army could have marched it. And somewhere in that spreading, minstrels turned Tywin's victory into a song. The Rains of Castamere, one that needed no explanation for anyone who'd heard how it ended. Whether it was meant to honor him or simply warn everyone else, it did both at once. Here's the part that rarely gets mentioned alongside the horror of it. It worked. Immediately and completely. Within the year, the newly crowned King Aerys II Targaryen named 20-year-old Tywin Lannister his Hand of the King. Not out of any particular fondness. Aerys, like every other lord in Westeros, had just watched exactly what this teenager was capable of when defied. And there was no safer place to put that kind of ruthlessness than directly at your own right hand, where it worked for you instead of against you. Tywin held that position for nearly 2 decades, effectively ruling the 7 kingdoms in all but name, while Aerys slowly lost his grip on his own reign. And the entire foundation of that authority, the reason great lords who privately despised the Targaryen court still obeyed the Hand without open defiance, traced back to a flooded mine and a collapsed keep in the Westerlands that most of them had never even seen. Even his own family wasn't spared once Tywin decided a debt needed settling. Years later, after Lord Tytos finally died, Tywin didn't stop at burying his father. Tytos's mistress, a woman who had spent years wearing his late mother's jewels and ruling Casterly Rock's household as though she were its true lady, while Tytos let her, was stripped and marched naked through the streets of Lannisport, forced to confess her position to every person she passed. It wasn't cruelty for its own sake, or at least not only that. It was Tywin, one final time, burning away every last visible trace of the soft, easily loved, easily used lord his father had been. The next time you hear that song, the lute in the Great Hall, the doors closing a little too quietly, the moment right before everything goes wrong, remember what it's actually describing. Not a battle fought honorably between armies, not a war won through clever strategy. A 19-year-old offered 2 honorable ways to end a rebellion without more bloodshed, who refused both of them and chose instead to bury a woman who once laughed at his father under a collapsed castle, and flood a mine full of men rather than ever be mistaken for someone who could be laughed at again. If this story is one you'd never heard the full version of before, that's exactly what this channel exists to do. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.
If this changed how you see the show, you're exactly who this channel is for. Hit like if the verdict landed, subscribe for the next deep dive, and leave your own verdict in the comments. I read every one. This is the Character Witness, where we put the story on trial. We'll see you in the next review.